Hi, welcome to more of our lighting lecture, where today we're going to be talking about how we can control light. Now, we've talked about the sources that create light, the instruments that you can put those sources in to generate the light, but we can also shape and manipulate the light to use it to our advantage and put it into ways that will best suit us. So one of the things that we have, and I'm going to disappear for a moment, is when we're creating light, we create one of two types of light, a hard light or a soft light. Now, a hard light comes usually from a single point of light, and it produces what are known as hard shadows. So if you ever look at your hand on the ground or your shadow on the ground during a sunny day, and you can see a perfect outline of your body, that's going to be a hard light. Now, the opposite is a soft light, and these come from a large diffused source. So you're usually not seeing the direct light, and as a result, shadows are less defined and probably even less visible. If you've ever looked at your shadow and you can't make out a definite edge, but you can see just like a dark area, that's going to be a soft light. And you'll see this particularly on a cloudy day. So when you look at shadows, shadows can tell you if you're looking at a hard light or a soft light. So I'm going to start with the hard light here on the right. If I look at her like under her nose, I can see a very definitive line of shadow. Same thing with along the side of her face. If I look down at her neck, I can definitely see where the shadow of her chin ends and her neckline begins. And so by looking at this, I can see that we have a very bright, hard light that is shining on her. Now, if we look at on the left where we have a soft light, I do have areas of dark and light. Yes, I do have shadows on her, but the shadows are a lot more subtle in how they blend. So I do not have a very hard jagged line, or if I look across her forehead from light to dark, you don't see a definitive line. Likewise, when I look at her neck and shoulder, I don't see a definitive line because the shadow gets a little bit fuzzier as we move across her face. So I can tell that this is areas that are both bright and less bright, but there's no defining lines that are creating that shadow. So because of that, I can tell that she has a hard shadow, or she has a soft shadow, and she has a hard shadow. And this is going to come into play when you're setting up lighting for a situation. If you want a very hard light to hit somebody, or if you want a very soft light. So if I look at my face, I can see that I do have like areas of light, areas of dark, but I don't have a whole lot of really definitive areas of shadow, not like under my eyes or my chin or anywhere else. I guess I could kind of see it like a little bit there. But this is telling me that I'm using a soft light, which is kind of diffusing, and it's kind of making for like a more flattering look than just a hard light that would be hitting me. So when I look at this shadow, I can see when I look at like her nose and her jawline and her neck that she has a very hard shadow. And judging by looking at the way this is working, it looks like it's coming from one single point. So a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, hard shadows will come from one single point. And in this case, that's coming from a light that's mounted on the front of the camera, which is just off to the right. But this is, I can definitely tell we have a hard shadow going on. So there are different ways that we can also change light to help us out. One of the first ones I talked about when I talked about the Fresnel lights is that there is a lens, and you can change the light from what's called a spotlight, which is a very tight beam, to a floodlight, which is a very wide beam. And so when you do that, you're going to create a less intense light. So here in the middle, I have a spotlight set up, very definitive line edges, as opposed to the left where I've moved over to a broad light, or the floodlight, and so that's giving me a wider range of light, and it's going to also help make it a little bit softer. Another type of way we can change lights is to put a filter or something in front of that light. And so one type of filter is what's known as a honeycomb or an egg crate. And so the way this works is with this honeycomb is the holes inside are not, when they're manufactured, they can possibly not be just a straight 90-degree circle. They might angle a little bit to let different light in. And as you can kind of see through my hand, as I angle it, you're seeing less of the light source behind me. So if they have a 10 degree, then all the honeycomb can be trying to focus the light in one middle area. If they're at a 40 degree or wider, then it's going to let more light through. So you can use a honeycomb in front of a camera or in front of a light to give you an effect. And you've probably seen on some photo shoots or pictures of photo shoots where they'll have like a big light that has this honeycomb pattern in it, and they're using that to kind of help adjust the light. Now, another thing to help are what are known as barn doors, and you'll see these a lot on the front of a Fresnel light. A Fresnel light can and usually has barn doors, and barn doors are these metal flaps that we can go through and give us like a narrow beam of light, or we can control where a shadow goes. So in our studio, what we have is we have like two anchors in the middle of our desk, and instead of having one light covering them all, we have the barn doors that are creating just narrow points of light. So in this case, we have, instead of barn door completely open, I have a narrow barn door, and so we can have just one set of light lighting up one person, and then the other one can have their own set of light. Or likewise, if we change the barn doors to be like a more horizontal, we could set the barn door to light from the desk to their head and not light everything behind them or everything below them on the set. So the barn doors give us the ability to do some shaping of light. Now, likewise, we can do the same thing with a flag. A flag works a lot like a barn door, but just on a larger scale. So in this picture, we have these two big panels that are kind of taped and standing up. And likewise, I've got another one over here. And these are flags. And so what they're doing is, right now, this flag is keeping this light from lighting up the wall behind her. It is causing a kind of a shadow on that area, and it's only lighting her backside. So when he takes a picture of her, he can have a good shot of her over like this grayish background, and the flag is keeping all that extra light from hitting that particular area. So we can also adjust lighting by making it, shifting it from a hard light to a soft light by passing it through a filter known as a scrim. And a scrim can look kind of like a screen, or it can look like a mesh. It can even look like a bed sheet that's probably going to be white. And as that hard light hits, it's going to become a lot softer. So in this picture in the bottom, I've got a very hard light hitting this bowl and this column. It's giving me a small area, and it's giving me a very definitive edge. But if I take one of these scrims and I move it in front of the light to diffuse it a little bit, you can kind of see the light has moved out a little bit. It's a little bit softer. Do I still have definitive lines? Yes. But it made it a little bit brighter. It moved the light out, and I'll take it back a second if it'll let me. Previous. There we go. So again, by taking that scrim out, you get a hard light, but when you put that light in and it diffuses it, it softens it, and it does kind of spread that out. So let's look at that one again. There you go. Now, another way to control light is to reflect it or bounce it. And so what this gentleman has is he's got just a large foldable screen that could be a reflective surface like a foil or a mirror reflective on one side. And then on the other side, like you can see, can be like white. So we can either reflect straight sunlight, or he can use that white to diffuse it or bounce it back. And that was used in a television show that was popular in America during the 50s and 60s called The Andy Griffith Show. And during the beginning of the show, you've got this father and son walking down this path, and it made for an iconic opening. And so as they go and set up the shot, I think in the open, the kid goes down, picks up a rock, and goes to throw it. But one of the things they were looking at when they were setting up for this shot was they were noticing that the sun was coming in very hard from, I guess it was coming in from this side, because I can tell from the shadows which direction the light was going. So that meant the other side of their faces didn't have the sunlight, but they still wanted to be able to see them. So they use a reflector to bounce light off of both sides to get onto the subject. So here they are in a behind the scenes shot using these reflectors, which probably had a little more of the foil reflection than the white reflection in them. And so that was giving them both light on both sides of their face. So one of the things that we can also use is what's known as a diffuser. And a diffuser works just like a scrim, but on a much larger scale. Scrims tend to be smaller sizes that are going to go in front of a smaller light. Diffusers, much bigger. We also have the ability to change the color of lights. So when I talked about things going from 32.6K to 56K, we have the ability to change them from those many color temperatures. And these can also include things like red, green, and blue. And back when we were using incandescent light bulbs, we would take these mats that were made of a gelatin, and these gelatins were very high temperature resistant, and we would just take one of these gels, for short, and we would insert them into a Fresnel light, and the light would just shine right through it. Even with the high temperatures, these gels did not melt because of the way they were manufactured. Now that we've gotten into LED technology, we have the ability to just pull up a control panel either on your phone or a light board, and you can control the colors of the LEDs inside the instrument itself to give you a red, a green, a blue, or another type of light. So now we've gotten to the point where we can even do all this on our phone and make changes on the fly. So when we're dealing with colors, one of the things that we're taught early on is what happens when you mix yellow and blue. What color do you get? If you've got yellow paint and blue paint, you mix them together and you get green. But it doesn't quite work the same when we're dealing with lights. With paint, your three main colors are red, yellow, and blue, and you can mix all of them to create all the colors in the spectrum. You can use them for anything that you're going to see. Now, in the realm of light works differently than paint and color pigments. So whereas you have red, yellow, and blue light, your basic primary colors are actually red, green, and blue. So I can mix green and blue to give one. I can mix red and blue to get something else, or red and green likewise. And so when we combine these colors, you're going to get different things. So when I mix red and green, I get yellow. When I mix red and blue, I get magenta. Or when I mix green and blue, I get what's known as cyan. And these colors are known as C, M, Y, and K. And K stands for black. Now, if you mix all three, red, green, and blue together, you get white. And this was, looking back at LEDs, why we didn't have white or LEDs for a while until we had blue. We had red, we had green, we had yellow. We just couldn't get the other colors. So a different way that we can control light is what's known as a gobo in the television industry. It's also known as a cookie because, like I said, it looks like a cookie cutter. And what this is a metal disc that has a uniquely shaped holes cut into it. And when light passes through, it gets blocked by the disc and the holes get through, and they're going to create an effect. And depending on the instrument you use, which is most likely an ellipsoidal light, you have the ability to make a very distinctive pattern, or you can make it a little more fuzzier by adjusting the focus. So a cookie is a great way to project a logo or an image onto the back of a set. So another piece of trivia for you. In the world of Hollywood, what is the most popular gobo used to date? And remember, a gobo is a disc that's used to project a logo or a pattern onto something. Well, if you answered Batman, you would be right. The concept of the bat signal was to have a shape matched onto a large light, and then that could project that shape onto, in this case, the clouds on the night, and that would be a signal for Batman to come to their aid. And so that's going to be a look at how we're able to adjust lights by controlling them through things like gels, gobos, cookies, color patterns, and different sources and ways of shaping light and molding it to the way we need it. So now that we know what creates light, how we get it, where we get it from, and we now know how to shape it, we need to apply it for use in a studio environment, or if you're out getting electronic news gathering, you're going to need to use lighting to your advantage to pull off what you need. And so for that, we have different lighting techniques that we're going to employ. So the first thing is, like I said, if you're outdoors, you're going to probably be shooting with sunlight as your main light source. And when you're dealing with sunlight, there are some things to consider. So one thing to consider is that the sun is going to usually create a very hard light, and it's going to give you hard shadows. And it's also going to cause some issues with your camera dealing with that contrast ratio. So in these top two images, I have the sun is behind my subject. I can look at the shadow on his neck, and I have very definitive shadows as I kind of look around, and I can see that his face is very dark, and from that's telling me that the sun is kind of right up behind him. In the case of this photographer who's shooting, they have the sun right behind the girl's head, and it's causing an issue to where you can't see her face because the sun and its flares are causing an issue. Now for the photographer, that's probably a very artistic choice. For a videographer, it's not going to work very well. So when you're out getting a shot, look at your environment, look at your subject, and adjust your cameras accordingly. So with this image in the bottom right, I can look at the subject and I can see there's a very hard shadow going across the middle of her neck and across her chest. I can see it's also creating very hard lines across her face. And so what I'm going to tell her to do is, can I get you to just turn a little bit one way to the other, and then I will move my camera around. So you can kind of see from her background that the operator did move the camera because the lighting is now different. And in this case, I can kind of see that instead of hitting her hard on the face, it's hitting her a little bit better. It's smoothing out the light, and that's helping as well. If I look in the bottom left picture here, I can see that this videographer has looked at his subject, and at first he could see that the light was maybe hitting him from behind or from the side, so he turned him so that the light was hitting him directly in the face, and that was going to light him up very well. So if you look at our reporter, you can kind of see that they have a darker face, and they can see the sun is to their back, but they are moving their subject matter, or their interviewer, so that the sun is going to cover up the front part of their body, thus giving them a much better shot. So in a studio, we don't have to quite deal with moving subjects around because we can control the lighting. And there's a type of lighting called 3-point lighting that studios tend to employ to get an ideal lighting environment. So based on where your camera is, you're going to have a main light that's going to be near the front. And this is what's called the key light, because this is the key instrument to provide most of your light for your subject. Now off to the side, if you have a key on this side, then you're going to have a lot of dark area over to their side. So for that, you're going to have a camera off a good bit that's going to provide a side light, and this is going to be called a fill. And the fill light is going to fill in the lighting on both the main and the side. And then we're going to have another light behind them that's going to do some lighting over their shoulder and the top of their head. And this is the backlight. And the backlight is going to be used to help to separate your subject from what is behind them. So let's take our 3-point lighting and put it into effect. So right now, I've got my camera. In this case, the key light is on the other side. So you can see the key light is giving her a lot of her main light, but the side of her face is still relatively in darkness. But if we look at the fill light is going to fill in that area that's missing, even though the key light is going to take care of the rest. And then when we look at the backlight, you can kind of see it's creating a silhouette and an outline of the top of her head and her shoulders, which is going to help separate her from the background. So let's put it all together and see how it looks. We have our key light. Now we're going to add in the fill light, and you can kind of see how her face is rounded out. We've removed a lot of the shadows. And then we're going to add the backlight, which is now going to separate her from the back of the background behind her. So this is now isolating her for the shot that we want, and this kind of gives us the lighting that we really like. Now sometimes you may want to illuminate the background behind them, and you may need to bring that into focus. So for that, we come to 4-point lighting. It is the same as 3-point. You still have your camera, you have your key, you have your fill, and you have your backlight, but now we've added a fourth light whose sole purpose is to shine light on whatever the background of your interview subject is. So in a television studio, you may wind up using something like 4-point, but to get ideal lighting for most of your subjects, 3-point light is definitely a good way to go. And so that's going to be the main way how we're going to control light for a studio environment. And so I can look at the light that's up above me, and I can see that I have a key light that's sort of backwards. I have a key light right here above my head that's doing shining straight on the guest. Camera's backwards. Guest that's over there. And then right above my head, I have another light that's kind of off to the side, and that's going to be that fill light. And you can't quite see, but there's some other lights above my head that are doing the key and the fill for each of our subjects. So by using this technique, we're able to create an ideal lighting situation both in the studio and out in the field for electronic news.